Distinguished leaders, ambassadors for peace, dear participants. My name is Jacques Marion. I'm the co-chairman of the Universal Peace Federation for Europe and the Middle East, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this program. Before we begin, let me make a practical announcement. The webinar will be in English and translated into the Russian language. If you need translation, please click on the globe at the bottom right of your screen and choose the Russian channel. The chat icon is for remarks and information, and the bios of the panelists will be available there as well. For questions, please use the Q&A icon. Our staff will answer your questions, and the questions to the panelists will be answered during our Q&A session. The webinars that we hold in the next 3 days are part of an international leadership conference series called ILC 2021, which focuses on the theme of the peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula. Whereas the last ILC in June was dedicated to issues of peace and security, this time we shall focus on Track 2 diplomacy initiatives and the role of non-state actors in the process of Korean reunification. To begin this program, I will invite the chairman of UPF Europe and the Middle East, Dr. Katsumi Otsuka, to give his welcoming remarks. Dr. Otsuka is from Japan. He has served in many positions of responsibility around the world, notably as president of the Family Federation for World Peace in Japan, Russia, and Africa. He has also led several organizations focusing on the reunification of the Korean Peninsula. Dr. Otsuka, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jacques. Distinguished panelists, ambassador for peace, and UPF friends. It is my greatest happiness to greet you, representing UPF Europe and the Middle East. Thank you very much for participating in the ILC 2021 July webinars. I'm very happy to greet you from my home city of Tokyo, where the 2020 Tokyo Olympic Games was begun. It is our greatest honor to welcome the Olympic athletes from all over the world. I have a very joyful days cheering for the Olympians from Europe and the Middle East, as well as Japanese. As you know, the modern Olympism was conceived by the Baron Pierre de Coubertin, on whose initiative the International Olympic Committee constituted itself in the year of 1894. The 1920 Olympic Games, held in the Antwerp, Belgium, 100 years ago, was organized under the difficult situation, tremendous difficulties caused by the First World War and the global pandemic of influenza, which is said to have killed about 45 million people all the world. The Antwerp Olympic greatly encouraged European people and contributed to the post-war reconstruction. History repeats itself. The 2020 Tokyo Olympic Game was held under the great challenges of the corona pandemic. I hope that Tokyo Olympic Game will also encourage the people of the world who have been suffering with the corona pandemic. Like a creation of the Olympic, the origin of the UPF can be sought back in the 20th century, the century of war and revolution. The Korean War broke out in 1950, is described sometimes as the Third World War. And this war was very ruthless and resulted in the division of the country into North and South. The founder of the UPF, Reverend Dr. Moon and Mrs. Moon, Hak Ja-han Moon, both were born in what is now North Korea. They experienced the Japanese 36 years rule, the Second World War, and the tragic Korean War. They were both literally refugees during the Korean War, and they could not see their relatives in North Korea freely even today. A young Dr. Moon was arrested by the communist government 2 years before the war broke out and sentenced to 5 years of the hard labor in the Hunnam prison, which is a Soviet-style gulag. He was among the first of the Christian ministers sent to the hard labor camp. He witnessed so many people dying with hunger, sickness, and execution in the extermination camp. In case of Dr. Hak Ja-han Moon, Mother Moon, at the age of 6 or 7 years old, she also suffered a lot as a refugee on the way down to Southern Korea. The UPF founders were both victims of the World War and the Communist Revolution. These experiences motivated them to work for world peace and unification of the Korean Peninsula by dialogue with mutual respect. Korean people think that the Korean War was the result of the Cold War, and they themselves are the victims. This is a fundamental understanding of the Korean people. In the Korean War, a nation was divided, people and the clans were split and killed each other, and families were divided. Therefore, it is not too much to say that the division of the Korean Peninsula is a kind of not a simple division, rather it was a manifestation of the old division of the world. Therefore, the reunification of the Korean Peninsula is very meaningful and significant in this regard. Dr. Moon and his wife, Dr. Hak Ja-han Moon, made a crucial step 30 years ago towards the establishment of the world peace through the peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula. They visited Pyongyang, North Korea in December 1991 to have a peace talk with the Supreme Leader, President Kim Il-sung, who once attempted to kill Dr. Moon. The agreement they signed became a fundamental North Korean policy towards South Korea in 1990s. They won the trust of the President of Kim Il-sung and high-ranking official of the North Korea. They played a crucial role in two tracks dialogue with the government of North Korea. Dr. Hak Ja-han Moon has a strong hope for visiting North Korea again, commemorating their first visit. Today, July 27th, is the anniversary of the armistice agreement for the Korean War was signed by North Korean, Chinese, and United Nations representatives in 1953. South Korea refused to sign this agreement. This was the day when the temporal peace was restored, but it was also the day the subsequent North-South division was fixed. The victims and destruction caused by the war were so terrible that both North Korea and South Korea had to invest huge energy for reconstruction of their own countries with the support of friendly nations. I think this is the time that the world should cooperate together for the peaceful reunification of the world, of the Korean Peninsula. For this goal, ILC2021 was designed to concentrate on the peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula and organizing discussions and exchanges all around the world. Dear UPF friends, in today's world, many of the problems are intricately intertwined and cannot be solved by one country alone. Therefore, the cooperation between nations is necessary for solving the problems. Taking all these environments into their consideration, the UPF founders presented the new ideologies of the headwind thought for realizing the universal peace. According to the founders' idea, the key words of the UPF will be empathy, cooperation, and togetherness with the heart of living for the sake of others. One concrete example of the UPF activity is the Peace Road in the Korean-Japan Undersea Tunnel project. This project is a project to connect the entire world with highway, bridge, and tunnel. The vision of the Peace Road initiative goes beyond the physical desire of economic benefits. It seeks for the spiritual dimension, aiming to tear down the wall of division in both spiritual and physical world dimensions. These projects will connect people in the world together as one family under God. UPF founders suggested that the construction of the undersea tunnel between Korea and Japan to former enemy nations on the occasion of the International Science Conference in Seoul in 1981. They later suggested the construction of the Bering Strait Tunnel and bridge for the unity of the USA and Russia. It is very inspiring that many young people organize the Peace Road event, mainly in summertime, linking the people in hostile relationship by walking, bicycling, by all means, in all around the world, including the Balkans, even Pyongyang, North Korea. Interfaith activity is one of the main pillars of the UPF activities. UPF founder never missed to encourage faith-based organizations to work for the universal peace of all humanity, regardless any differences. It would be very wonderful if religion can work together cooperatively for all humanity. Let me encourage you to give deeper concern to the International Association for Peace and Development. This is one of the functions of the UPF by religious leaders and political leaders. I have more to share with you, but I want to close my greetings here, expressing my deep appreciation again to your participation in the ILC 2021. Please have a joyful and fruitful time in this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Otsuka. Thank you for your insightful message, really, thank you. Before I introduce the moderator of the first session, let me give you a very brief overview of the upcoming 3-day program. I will share a PowerPoint very briefly. So after this first opening session, which is on track 1.5 diplomacy initiatives with North Korea, our next session will start this afternoon at 2 p.m. Central European Time on the resources and faith-based organization in support of Korean reunification with high-level religious leaders from Europe, Russia, and Korea. Our third session today at 4 p.m. will be about humanitarian initiatives and their potential to help overcome the division of the Korean Peninsula. Tomorrow, July 28, we will begin at 10 a.m. with a session on the emerging power of women diplomacy with prominent women leaders from our region. Session 5 tomorrow at 2 p.m. will deal with the potential role of the private sector to develop the North Korean economy. Speakers will share based on their own experiences on the peninsula. Session 6 at 4 p.m. tomorrow will deal with art and culture as a factor of peace. We also have a great panel of culture experts with a vast experience in Northeast Asia. And on the last day, on the last day, on July 29, our morning session will be at 10 a.m. with youth leaders who will share about how young people from North and South are mobilizing for peace and reconciliation. Our 8th session will be about the Peace Road Initiative, a project initiated to overcome the division between North and South Korea, and as Dr. Otsuka just shared, which has become a worldwide project to overcome the legacy of conflicts between peoples and nations across borders. So we have a very interesting program ahead, and it's time now to start our first session. So I'm very pleased to introduce to you the moderator of this session, Mr. Humphrey Hoxley. Humphrey Hoxley is an author, commentator, and broadcaster. His recent book, Asian Waters, examined the conflict in Northeast Asia and the South China Sea. He was a BBC foreign correspondent for many years and reported on events and conflicts from all over the world. He opened the BBC's television bureau in Beijing, China. Humphrey Hoxley also has a personal connection to our panelist today, Antonio Betancourt. They met in Beijing in the early 1990s when the issues of peace and security on the Korean Peninsula were high on the agenda, and we will hear more about this. Humphrey, the floor is yours.
Thank you, thank you. Welcome everybody. From me, your moderator, Humphrey Hoxley. Thank you, Jacques, Marion, and Dr. Katsumi Otsuka of the Universal Peace Federation for Europe and the Middle East. And thank you for giving us the program, Jacques, and Dr. Otsuka, the perspective and canvas on which we're going to be debating, because that's very important. We have a fascinating debate coming up with brilliant contributors. Glyn Ford, a former British member of the European Parliament, and as Jacques mentioned, my old friend, Dr. Antonio Betancourt, with whom I made a historic visit to North Korea in the 1990s. Listen to what they have to say, then question and challenge them through the Q&A function. I will feed in your ideas, your thoughts and arguments, and on your behalf, I will demand answers. Now, as Jacques was saying, these dialogues are really important because they comprise conversations that include a mix of government officials participating unofficially and non-government experts. They don't carry the official weight of traditional diplomacy, but they offer a private, open environment to build trust, talk, and brainstorm solutions that cannot be done in official capacities. That's why we are here and why we are doing what we are doing. Our first panelist is Professor Glyn Ford, who is a Labour member or as a Labour member of the European Parliament from 1984 to 2009, turned his antennae towards Asia, serving on the International Trade and Foreign Affairs Committee, and as a rapporteur for the Free Trade Agreement with ASEAN and several other roles, which saw him visiting North Korea some 50 times. That's 50 times. I think I'm right on that. 3 years ago, Glyn published a book entitled Talking with North Korea, Ending the Nuclear Standoff. And in May, a couple of months ago, he wrote a highly critical piece against the G7 hardline policy on North Korea and its nuclear weapons program, telling the US it was time to quit playing games and get its eye back on the ball. So with that thought, Glyn Ford, the screen is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for the kind invitation to participate in the first of a series of events over the next 3 days. I'm delighted to be able to make hopefully a useful contribution in some way. I intend in my 10 to 15 minutes to try and do two things. Firstly, to talk a little bit about the process of track 1.5 diplomacy as it affects me. And secondly, to talk about some of the products, some of the knowledge that's come out of that in terms of an appreciation of the situation on the peninsula and probably more particularly in Pyongyang and North Korea. As you said, I've been to North Korea just shy of 50 times. My first trip was back in 1997 when I was a member of the European Parliament. I was approached by the North Korean embassy to UNESCO. They had no embassy to the European Union or to any of its member states apart from Sweden and to UNESCO. And they came to see me in 1997 saying that there was a food crisis in North Korea and could I help them, if you want, get food aid from the European Union, particularly in the light of the fact that at the time we had the problem of BSE and we were actually killing and destroying hundreds of thousands of tons of meat that the North Koreans would very much have appreciated being shipped to North Korea. My response was very simple. I need to see the situation on the ground before I can argue the case, and myself and two colleagues went to North Korea, two Labour colleagues, on an unofficial delegation. I'm not a scientist. Well, I actually am. I'm a geologist, but that really doesn't help you very much in hospitals and orphanages. But even I could see that the situation was pretty grim. I told them not to show us the nice bits of North Korea. If we were going to go back and argue for aid, we needed to see the rather more unpleasant things. I concluded the visit by saying, would you like an official visit from the European Parliament? And they said, yes, of course. So I went back and we tabled a resolution in the European Parliament demanding that the North Koreans allow an official delegation to visit North Korea and to look at the situation. If I'd actually said we should send a delegation to that nice country, North Korea, it would never have happened. And I think rather to the surprise of the European Parliament, the response to our demands was, yes, please send a delegation. And that started a process that's, in a sense, still ongoing now. I won't go into all the details, but as I said, I've been traveling to North Korea for a period of over 20 years, getting close to 25 years. Back in 2010, after I'd lost my seat in the European Parliament, the voters of the southwest of England decided they preferred someone else rather than me. Maybe they were right. I was approached by the international department of the party. Because I'm a politician, most of my visits to North Korea have not been supported by, if you want, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but rather the international department of the party. And I was asked if I could set up a political dialogue with the party. Frankly, I said that I can't find any political party of any significance that's going to be prepared to do that. But what I can do is to collect together a small group of former senior political figures in the European Union, and we can use that as the basis for a dialogue. Since then, probably on about 15 occasions in the last, maybe more, since 2010, a small group of people have actually traveled to Pyongyang with only on a singular occasion as the North Koreans been able to come to Europe. And we've had this dialogue with the head of the international department of the party. When we started, it was a man called Kim Jong-il. He was succeeded by Kang Suk-ju, who was the chief negotiator in the six-party talks. And then very briefly, when Kang Suk-ju was ill, by Chae Tae-bok, the Speaker of the Supreme People's Assembly, who was double hatting as the head of the international department. And more recently by Ri So-young, who was not only a member of the Central Committee, the Politburo, he was on the executive of the Politburo, which meant that he was one of the 10 most senior North Koreans, and in fact was responsible for foreign policy along with Kim Jong-un. Ri So-young was in the room with Xi, with Moon, and with Trump. So that's the man we've been having a dialogue with, who's hosted us. The normal pattern was that we obviously travel to Pyongyang, have a meeting for probably 4 or 5 hours in the morning, then some visits over the coming days and some other meetings, including people from the United Front Department, because of course, North-South Korea relations are not foreign policy, they are domestic policy. And so it's not the international department that deals with that, but rather in party terms, the United Front Department. And then we will come back and have a final long dinner with Ri So-young to assimilate everything that we've discussed. It's slightly strange. I mean, there are no dialogues with North Korea that aren't sort of governmental on their side to a variety of degrees. Most people in terms of track 2s, track 1.5s with North Korea deal either with the Institute for American Affairs, which is part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or the Institute for Disarmament and Peace, which is another part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We're off on the side with our relationship with the party. What do I know that I wouldn't know if I hadn't had this dialogue, and what can we feed into the process? Firstly, Ri So-young is in the position to be able to speak fairly openly, in the sense that if you speak to people at a substantially lower level, you get the official public line. But certainly from Ri So-young's position, and it's in my book, so this is no great confidence is being given away, the North Koreans are not interested in early unification. Early unification can only be assimilation, and that, of course, they don't want. That's the East German model of unification, which for them is unacceptable. They are not a collapsed state. What they want is for the United States, in their opinion, to get off their backs and to actually allow them to grow themselves. They argue that they are as hardworking, as committed, as intelligent as the South Koreans. Given a lifting of, if you want, the hostile policy from the United States, they could grow their economy at 10, 15% a year for 10, 20 years, and then they will be somewhere close to being able to actually have a serious discussion about unification from a situation of both being in the same league. Secondly, I mean, I'm not an enthusiast for, if you want, North Korea's nuclear program, but it's driven by weakness, not by strength. North Korea spends a fifth, it spends 25% of its budget, but it spends a fifth of what South Korea spends on armaments every year. It spends 1/50th, 2% of what South Korea, Japan, and the United States spend on its military. So they've lost the arms race. They've been outlapped. The only way to actually guarantee regime survival from their perspective has been the development of weapons of mass destruction, principally, if you want, nuclear weapons and the ability to deliver them in the short, medium, and long ranges with the intercontinental ballistic missiles. They actually stopped that process in a gray area. It's fairly clear that they could crash a missile on North America. It could hit anywhere in the United States, possibly from Florida, but there is as yet no evidence that these missiles have the capacity to carry the payload of a nuclear weapon. Re-entry capacity is short and they have no guidance. But nevertheless, it obviously got the attention of President Trump, and we got the negotiations that took place. Secondly, it also doubles up in terms of helping the economy, because the situation with North Korea is there are two major shortages. The shortages are energy, and that's why North Korea is very wed to its civil nuclear program, or the ability to have one, and which is why some of the arguments at the moment are going on in Washington between, if you want, the likes of Jake Sullivan, who's happy to stick with the Singapore Declaration as a foundation document for a negotiation, and Antony Blinken, who refers to the denuclearization of North Korea, are so important. I'm not sure that Blinken actually understands, by avoiding Trump language, that he's creating the problem he is. But from the North Korean perspective, denuclearization of the peninsula means that they can keep their own civil nuclear program, because the South won't give up its civil nuclear program, whereas denuclearization of North Korea puts that to the question. So that's a problem. But secondly, of course, having weapons of mass destruction like nuclear weapons means that you can start freeing people from the military. North Korea has roughly 1 million people in the military. If you just cut conscription from 10 years to 9, you would free up 100,000 men. It's manpower, men that are in the army. The North Korean vision of the economy is a rather old-fashioned one. It's one where thousands of people are in factories, not one that we necessarily associate these days with how industry works in much of the rest of the world. But it might just work in North Korea, because there is the last global pool of low-wage, skilled labor. And so you could just about imagine that could actually work. The last point I'm going to make is, where do we go from here? There seems to be some recognition by President Biden that any solution is going to take a decade. It's going to be a long-term process. There's no meeting that does there's a meeting that does the deal, but unrolling that deal will take a decade. You have to build trust on both sides, and it has to be a step-by-step process. That's important. The North Koreans are very interested and exercised by the fate of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with respect to the Iran deal. They're interested in it because, unlike the agreed framework back in the 1990s, there will be no president was in the position to tear it up. Bush tore it up. The agreed framework was over when Bush said it was over. With the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, when Trump tried to do the same thing, the response was actually, hang on. It wasn't just the Russians and the Chinese, but the British, the French, and the Germans said, no, the Iranians are sticking, the Iranians are delivering on their side of the deal. So it had a resilience and robustness that the agreed framework didn't. Biden promised to go back to renegotiate the JCPOA, and we're in a tricky situation. From the North Korean perspective, if there is more than a few face-saving changes, it means that any deal done with one president cannot be guaranteed with a second president. And if it's a 10-year deal, that's 2 more presidents to come before the deal reaches a conclusion, both in the United States and, of course, in South Korea. However, if a deal is done fairly easily, the problem then is that there will be enormous pressure from Congress not to give such an easy deal to North Korea. So it may make the negotiations more difficult. The good news is it was announced today. It's been ongoing for a while, probably certainly to my knowledge since the middle of June. But it's been announced today that the hotlines have been reopened, and we are aware that the South Koreans are building a large a secure conference facility for video conferencing. I won't go into the whole problems of COVID. So it looks as though negotiations will start, and we had a South Korean delegation touring Europe last week, trying to persuade parliamentarians, including in the European Parliament. I met with them in Brussels to actually endorse an end of war declaration. I think President Moon, who leaves office early next year, might be willing and might be able, given the right following wind, to actually deliver an end of war declaration. It would be very appropriate for us to discuss on this day, which is the anniversary of the armistice. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Gwyn Ford, thank you so much for that. What an insight that gave us. But we're getting lots of questions in, so keep them coming, about language, about the famine, about the opening of communications that Gwyn Ford just mentioned. But before we move on, I wondered if I could get you to encapsulate a thought that you mentioned there. You said that they're not interested in early unification, that's North Koreans. They want the US to get off their backs and grow themselves so that they're not assimilated into the South Korean system or American system or whatever. Well, how could that work? Because the US isn't going to get off their backs, particularly if occasionally, or quite often the nuclear weapon is sort of held up there as a sort of symbol of its strength. And also I wondered if you could touch on the role of South Korea, because over the past 25 years since you've been involved, South Korea is sort of got one foot in the Chinese camp, as it were now, or more in the Chinese camp than it was in the American camp, and how that might unfold over the next 10 or 15 years. Well,
there's enough questions in there for me to probably speak for an hour or so. So I'll
give you a couple of minutes.
Yeah. Firstly, I think South Korea's probably got a toe in the Chinese camp rather than a foot, but fine. Yeah. I didn't really mention the fact that although the fundamental negotiations between to resolve the problems on the Korean Peninsula have to be between Washington and Pyongyang, actually that no solution is possible without internationalizing the event from both sides' point of view. From the North Korean perspective, they want security guarantees, and Ri So-young made it very clear that security guarantees are not a piece of paper signed by a US president. They want something that's much more solid than that. And so they're looking to, and I mentioned the JPCOA, I didn't go into the architecture, but it seems to me that they're looking for something similar. The JPCOA was the UN Security Council plus Germany in that particular case. I think if, in terms of security guarantees, it will be the Security Council plus, but the pluses will be different. One of the pluses will certainly be South Korea, because that it's not possible without South Korea, and the other, which is more questionable, will be Japan. Partly because Abe will never have gone while Otsuka is prime minister, and that's a whole different discussion. But the North Koreans were being used as a justification for removing Article 9 from the from the American-imposed constitution on Japan. So you've got that international dimension. Secondly, I disagree that nothing is possible. We need to be very clear, and I didn't even mention sanctions, but when the North Koreans talk about sanctions lifting, they're not talking about US sanctions, apart possibly from banking sanctions. They're talking about UN sanctions, because they've never traded with the United States. There have been US sanctions against North Korea since its formation. Those US sanctions have gone on forever. So it's UN sanctions that need to be lifted. But also, as part of any deal, like with the agreed framework, back with the agreed framework in 1994, in exchange for giving up their ambitions to make nuclear weapons, the North Koreans were going to have 2 light water reactors built by the Kado Consortium. Those were going to cost $4.5 billion, 2/3 of which was going to be paid by South Korea. There will be however it's dressed up, the North Koreans talk about reparations, they talk about paying the cost for the psychological damage to their country, for the historical damage and the rest. The Americans talk about, if you want a better North Korea, Trump did that famous or infamous video of condos on the beach in Wonsan.
That's right.
That's going to require money. And so there will be an industrial fund, and the US is already talking behind the scenes, at least, about a donors conference. Because the problem is that neither Trump nor Biden would have been willing or able to deliver money to North Korea. Congress would never have allowed it. So it means somebody else is picking up the bill. South Korea will pick up something between 2/3 and 70%. Who fills the gap? Last time with Kado, it was Japan and the European Union. European Union would certainly be willing to make a contribution. Japan is more problematic, but it's possible you could get something out of Russia's Eastern policy, or even a branch line from the Belt and Road Initiative from Beijing. But you're going to have to put together that, and some of it's going to have to be delivered before the end of the process. So whatever it is, it may be infrastructure in some ways, whatever it is, the North Koreans are going to benefit from that, and that's going to allow them to at least start growing their economy from the bottom up.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you for that. We could go on because that sparks, as you said, a number of questions, but we are now moving on to Dr. Antonio Betancourt. And what a pleasure to be working with you again, Antonio, although that doesn't mean I'm going to let you off the hook. Antonio is the former director of the International Office of Peace and Security, a key UPF initiative for world experts to discuss volatile areas of tension. He also served as the executive director of the Summit Council for World Peace, during which he visited North Korea 16 times, meeting President Kim Il-sung 5 times, and played a key role in the visit of Father and Mother Moon to North Korea in 1991, and later in 1994, the visit of former President Jimmy Carter. During those tense times leading up to the framework agreement that we've been discussing, Antonio was a pivotal player and trusted so much that he was one of the few Westerners invited to attend Kim Il-sung's funeral. In my personal interest and friendship with Antonio, I heard in the mid-1990s that he was the man to get a journalist into Pyongyang. So I flew up to Beijing to meet him in a hotel, and we had just sat down to have our coffee or whatever. And the concierge comes over and says that Antonio has a call. So off he goes. We didn't really have cell phones in those days. And he comes back and says that there was an emergency and he had to go to another meeting. And I thought, what? I've come all this way, and he blows me off in a couple of minutes. He sees my expression and he says, no. We're both going to this meeting. They are important people, and you and I have a war to stop. And that was the beginning of a beautiful friendship with Antonio Betancourt. And Antonio, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar 2021. It is a pleasure to see you. I haven't seen you for a long time, Humphrey. I have very good memories of you and your wife. And I was wondering, what are you up to now? I like to speak about the reconciliation of Father Moon and Mother Moon with Kim Il-sung, with the Kim Il-sung clan or Kim Il-sung dynasty, as a preconditions for major involvement of Father Moon's resources to help North Korea to upgrade the meetings and the dialogue with the US, which by 1991, it was almost nil, almost zero. There were discussions at a very low level in Beijing, but whatever they discussed never transcended, never went to the Secretary of State or the President. So Father Moon had this idea in order to help North Korea to join the community of nations, even as a socialist state like Vietnam or Cuba or other countries, it was necessary for an upgrade of dialogue between the two countries. So that was my job, and we did that. Father Moon knew that it would be very difficult for a representative of him and the Unification Church to be able to visit Pyongyang and be welcomed officially there. So he asked me to, he told me that there will be a new policy of the Unification Church and the Unification Movement globally towards North Korea to end of hostilities and end of the war of ideological war and by other means, that they will initiate a policy of reconciliation and working together for the sake of the Korean people, and working towards an eventual unification. So he asked me to visit the embassies of every DPRK diplomatic representation in countries that I visit in my mission, in my job globally. I was kicked out of every embassy because they would welcome me because I had about 4 or 5 big titles that they were very impressive to them. But on the other hand, I had a very bad reputation because I was born in Colombia, and Colombia fought against them. So they carried grievances against Colombia. I was a Moonie, so they carried big grievances against the Moonies and against Samuel Moon and their Unification Church. And I was also an American citizen by choice. So they hated this thing. So I went to the embassies and the ambassador as soon as I revealed who I really was, beyond my titles and all these flashy cards that I presented. They will escort me out. And so the letter that Reverend Moon asked me to write to Kim Il-sung, announcing the new policies of the unification movement, and he himself towards Kim Il-sung family and towards North Korea, that letter was never delivered. So I complained to the chairman of the Summit Council for World Peace, who was President Rodrigo Carazo of Costa Rica, who was a member of the international, he was a social democrat. And he had a friendship with Kim Il-sung and also with Fidel Castro as a socialist. And he has helped to establish, I believe, a teaching of peace studies in Kim Il-sung University. So he said, I can help you. I can take you to North Korea. So he began to write letters, and they were not respond. So at last he says, well, let's go through Fidel Castro and the Foreign Office of Cuba, and that worked. Fidel Castro helped him and helped us, and this is an irony for the members of the unification movement who don't want to touch even moderate leftists, because they are now convinced that every left is a conduit to communism, which is very strange. And there is very little relationships of the movement with the Democrats in the US and globally. So in any case, the route to Reverend Moon going back to the place of his birth to reconcile with his nemesis who tried to kill him and send a commando to kill him and his family in the US, and this was caught by the FBI in New Jersey. It was through Cuba and it was through the left. So let's not forget that for God, God is in charge, and God uses evil for a good purpose, and he uses good for not for evil purposes, for greater good purposes. So in any case, they responded through the embassy of Nicaragua, their embassy in Nicaragua, and we went and picked up our visas, and we went in April of 1991. The first thing we offered to them, after all the drills that they do on people like us who are not persona non grata, they drill you for 3 days and they treat you like a piece of dirt. But Reverend Moon prevented me and educated me in the diplomatic work that I did by telling me that you don't achieve anything by demonizing your adversaries. You don't go anywhere. You don't achieve anything of your objectives. You have to give respect and dignity, he said, to your adversaries, even though you believe that they don't deserve dignity and respect. You have to give it to them, and then you'll see how this brings results. So I practiced that in my meetings with Pyongyang. I found them extremely sincere with their beliefs in Kim Il-sung and Juche and their ideas. But I projected an energy of friendship and genuine friendship and honesty. And they appreciate that. They appreciate the honesty and they appreciate respect. Because since they treat adversaries very bad when you go there, you have the tendency to respond in equal terms, but I didn't. And Carazo also told me, treat them with respect and they will respect you. So that's what happened. So the first thing we offered them was something that never happened before with the North Koreans. And that was that we consult with them to establish a commission on Korean reunification from different angles by former presidents and prime ministers in Washington. And they were thrilled that we consulted with them. There's all kinds of meetings in the US and Japan and in Europe without them, in which they don't participate. So they were very happy that we consulted with them and asked them for the program if we were pleased with the program and so forth, and they say yes. So we invited to chair that meeting the one who became ambassador to the St. James Kingdom, the UK, Admiral Crowe, who was the guy who gave legitimacy to the campaign to Clinton. So the two of them were very close because there was a campaign of the Republicans to discredit Clinton's friendship with the military, that the military hated him and that he would be no good for defense. So we invited him because he had access directly to Clinton. And since our goal was to begin to upgrade the discussions and the dialogue between the two countries, not the DPRK and the US. So the meeting went well, and we produced a very nice report that we sent to North Korea. And as a result of that, we were called to come back to discuss. And then the next was to basically bring Father Moon and Mother Moon and a delegation of Koreans to their birthplace. Mother Moon was born in Onju in the north, and Reverend Moon was born in I forgot the name of the village. So they went there to reconcile with Kim Il-sung and create an enormous amount of goodwill that lasts until today. The other thing that we did apart from bringing Father Moon to reconcile and to visit his birthplace, was we continued to be with them and to monitor their relations with the U.S. and promoting the dialogue and the program that was closed by Bush, as a previous speaker mentioned. The North Koreans were basically performing what was in those treaties and in those communiques that started with Father Moon's meeting with Kim Il-sung. He signed a 10-point communique with Kim Il-sung that called for inter-ministerial meetings, which happens about 40 days after Reverend Moon left North Korea, and the meetings with the U.S. at high-level meetings, including even the Secretary of State Fulbright visit North Korea. Thanks to all those efforts and all that goodwill that we were building we were kind of in between them, in between the U.S. and not on an official capacity, but we were communicating with the State Department, and we had a very good contacts there at a very high level, that these things were communicated immediately to the Secretary of State and the President. So we found out that the U.S. with South Korea, pressured by South Korea and other countries, were trying to get hold of the remittances that the South Korean or North Korean sympathizers in Japan towards the regime. They were contributing every year with about $600–700 million contributions to Kim Il-sung's fund for the country, and the U.S. was going to go after that as part of the sanctions to prevent Japan from, of course, with the cooperation of Japan and South Korea, to stop those remittances. So we heard from the office of Kim Jong-il that this will be a cause for war. So they asked me to please communicate to the Moon family, the Moon clan, to leave Seoul, because there's going to be a war. At that time, we knew that President Carter was exploring the possibility of going there to visit with Kim Il-sung, but he knew that this was not approved by neither the State Department nor the President, the White House. So I called President Carter and I emphasized the necessity of him to go, and that even if it was without official sanctions by the White House and South Korea. So he did, because President Carter became more active internationally as a former president that as president. So he did a very good job in promoting peace and dialogue and stability and assistance to many countries. So we realized that because there was such a hostility for his trip to North Korea by the South Koreans and by the Americans, we knew that whatever happens there between Kim Il-sung and President Carter will be filtered through the traditional bias of the intelligence services of South Korea and the US. And the news that will filter around the world will be stained or will be spin in a direction contrary to what this was supposed to produce. The goal of President Carter was to reduce the tensions and forget about the war and go about it, establishing a better dialogue with the North at that level of the President Kim Il-sung. So I suggested to President Carter to bring CNN, and he agreed. But Father Moon also agreed to bring CNN. But the North Koreans did not understand why they needed to to have this network that they hated. I said, because if you want to have the meetings and what they discuss, what they agree, known without filter, without pollution by the intelligence services with the traditional bias and serving their traditional interests of their countries, you have to have CNN, because CNN will publish as it is. So we did. So we invited the vice president of CNN to come in the future, but to mobilize the bureau from Beijing. And so Mike Chinoy was the guy who they selected, and so the rest is history. The world was able to see this diplomacy at work with Kim Il Sung and President Carter, and then the U.S. had to receive President Carter's when he came back with his news, and they were thrilled by what happened. They didn't think that this would be like that. So that was a very serious accomplishment. And the dialogue continued, and unfortunately, the left and the right in the US has loved to hate North Korea. For rightly so, because North Korea, there has been shenanigans and doing all kinds of things that the US does not approve or hate. And so the fact of the Korean War left a very bad blood between the U.S. and the DPRK and of course South Korea. So these things prevented scholars and journalists from being objective towards North Korea, and any objectivity towards North Korea was denounced by intelligence services and the media in South Korea and also in America as appeasement, and that we didn't understand the danger of North Korea and so forth and so forth. But we were, educated by Father Moon, and Father Moon had a totally different view. He felt that communism based on dialectical materialism has to enter into a dialogue with capitalism and democracy, because democracy is centered on God, even though it's more centered on God from the rhetorical point of view rather than a practice. But the birth of democracy is the gospel of Jesus, and all democracies believe in God. They don't practice it, but they believe in a God. While dialectical materialism and historical materialism, the basis for the values of North Korea, are godless. But Reverend Moon believed in that dialogue. So he also encouraged me to talk to them about the necessity of this dialogue. So I start to discuss with them the possibility of studying the divine principle, the revelations that Reverend Moon received in the mountains of North Korea from the 1936 on until he left North Korea as an exile to South Korea after the commando, the U.S. commando and the UN commando attacked the camp where the concentration camp where he was going to be killed the next day. They were killing all these prisoners because they knew that the camp was going to be raided by the one who became later on General Haig, became Secretary of State. He was the leader of that commando, and later on he said that he learned that he liberated Samuel Moon from that Hungnam prison camp, concentration camp. And all the prisoners there were basically sent there to die. Mostly were Christian ministers and people who have confessional objections to communism and to godless, atheism. So I began to tell them that the commonality of the revelations, the spiritual revelations of Father Moon, to build a world based on principle rather than on interest. nations, interests of nations, which has been developed until today. And today, the purpose of life is profits, and the purpose of life is dominion, is control, and the purpose of life is peace to strength and peace to a big stick, and diplomacy is in shambles. So Reverend Moon sent me there to convince them that it was important for us to study Juche and find the similarities of values that will bring good news and good things to the people. And together with studying democracy and divine principle, and they agree. So they invited me to come to sign the agreement in which we will open offices, the office of the Federation for World Peace, which was the organization that Reverend Moon used to visit the country. He didn't go there as a religious leader. He went there as a civil leader of an international, a global organization called the Federation for World Peace, which today is the Universal Peace Federation. And they agreed to open those offices. And I was there. I went there, and the night before we were to sign the papers, Kim Il-sung died. I was there. And in the morning, they were supposed to come to pick me up for the meeting and signing the papers, and this didn't happen. And I was surprised that it was 9 o'clock and nobody came from 7:30 waiting. And so at 9 o'clock, somebody showed up and crying that the great leader had died. So I decided to just come back, get back to Beijing and back to the States. And when I arrived in Beijing, I was surprised to find the staff of the embassy waiting for me at the airport, asking me to please come back. You are a VIP invited to the funeral. And I said, no. See, you're going to invite me, you have to invite an actual Korean representing Reverend Moon, which is Dr. Bohi Pak. And so I called Bohi Pak. They agree, absolutely. They didn't think that South Korea will let him come. Dr. Pak defied the security laws that prevent him from going there. And the next day, he was on a plane to Beijing, and together we traveled to Pyongyang. And we gave our condolences to Kim Jong-il and to the big superstructure of leadership of all the different ministries and offices there. And we continue to build a great goodwill. This make Kim Il-sung very angry in South Korea, and he applied to Dr. Pak the security laws, and they exiled him in Japan for 3 years. And it was thanks to, I take credit for that because I worked with the State Department, particularly with Dr. John Merrill, who was the director for the Office of Intelligence Office for Northeast Asia, a very high position at the State Department. And I begged him to work with talk to the Secretary of State to pressure South Korea to bring Dr. Pak back to South Korea because he lost everything. Kim Il-sung stripped him of his hero medals and hero titles because he was a hero of the Korean War. Out of all the 300 graduates of the military academy of cadets of South Korea, he was one of 5, I believe, who survived the war, and he was a very a great hero, a great violent man at the war. And they deprived him of his title, and they completely ruined his reputation because of that. So thanks to the U.S. pressure, he was able to come back to North Korea. And the history continues. We still have goodwill with them, and I advised Dr. Pak on the investments, to put our money where the mouth is, and the Reverend Moon contributed with hundreds of millions of dollars to build a factory for automobile manufacturing and other things. And and bought a hotel and restored it for Western style diplomacy and so forth. So I finished there.
Okay, can I just, that's fantastic insight there, Antonio. And before we move on to the Q&A, because we've got a stream of questions coming in, I just wanted to pick you up on one thing. You said that you were taught you don't achieve anything by demonizing your adversary, yet that appears to be what the US strategy is with all its conflicts, isn't it? Whether it's Saddam Hussein, whether it's Ho Chi Minh, whether it's Fidel Castro, whether it's now Xi Jinping in China. Just give me a nugget of your thought on that. Is there a sort of two parallel tracks going there? And give me a yes or no. Is North Korea actually a threat to America? Because if it did fire any of those missiles in a really serious way, it would just get wiped out.
My answer is no, because they don't want to. They don't want to go in flames. With the U.S. could perfectly do it. They're there to attack Los Angeles. Their technology can only reach, in my opinion, maybe the West Coast. But anybody who attacks the U.S., look at Japan. What happened to Japan? So there is that experience, you know, the retaliation of the U.S. U.S. is a benign power in deals basically with principles of war. But when it's attacked like that, they have no principles. They just go for raw vengeance. Look what happened with Osama bin Laden. So exactly. No, the answer is no. However, they could mess up the region there, and they can hit the U.S. indirectly, where it hurts the most. Yeah. They can turn Seoul into a lake of fire.
So in a way, that feeds into what Glenn Ford was saying, is that they can be allowed to grow and on their own terms without the US being on their back all the time. We have a heap of really interesting questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one topic, wrap it up, and give the first one to Glenn Ford, and then I'm going to come back to you, Antonio, with another one, and then we'll see how the discussion pans out from there. So Lance Gardner and somebody else whose name I've lost, how can we help to avoid the impending famine in North Korea due to the drought and closing of border with China on COVID? And the other one said the same thing. Glenn Ford, you became involved on the famine issue. What's the situation now, and how can it be alleviated?
Unfortunately, these humanitarian things get lost in the big discussion.
Hold on, Antonio. This is for Glenn Ford to answer here, and then I've got another one for you after that.
Oh, okay. He's better equipped to answer that question. Yeah.
I'm going to go from one to the other. Glenn, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, very simply. Firstly, I think that North Korea probably has avoided any significant problem with COVID-19, partly because they locked down extremely early, and I mean they've been even more draconian than, if you want, the Chinese, the Australians, or New Zealand. But the consequence of that is they paid an enormous economic price, and so the problem has been an economic one that has not been helped by a rather poor harvest. So there are real problems in parts of North Korea, particularly in what I call the Rust Belt, which is the northeast, not so much Wonsan, but north of Wonsan, places like Hamhung, Hungnam, Kimchek, Chongqing, where people are seriously hungry. I don't think there's any starvation at the moment, but that doesn't mean to say that people aren't suffering. The problem is they've just about got through now to this year's harvest. That means things will get a little bit better, but it does mean that by spring next year, we're going to be back in the same problem on a much worse scale. So we need to be preparing to actually help deal with that problem in early 2022. And so
spring 2022 is the sort of crunch line that we need to be working towards. And of course, competing with...
Even if there was a problem now, it would take you 2 months to deliver anything. That's the realities of international aid. We need to be starting now to be preparing help and assistance for next year. Also is linked into COVID. In my view, they've largely controlled it. I don't want to get into an argument, are there any cases at all? But comparatively they have, but at enormous cost. But we also need to get vaccines in there, because if you want food aid coming in, if you want assistance coming in, you need to allow people in, and that means you need at least the population of Pyongyang to be inoculated. We probably need a production plant for an appropriate vaccine actually built in North Korea, like the European Union is building in Senegal for the benefits of Africa.
Good, you're right. So we need to start now, and of course, competing with Yemen and other places like that are all demanding international attention. Antonio, I'm back to you on this. Walter Maroof says, why is the North so adamant of not signing a peace treaty? Antonio?
Because they don't trust. It's lack of trust. You know, we've been advocating for that for the last 30 years. And there is no trust on their part that the parties will live up to that. They are afraid to be, to be signing something that is not in their interest, even though we could convince them that it is in their interest to sign a peace treaty. But the U.S. doesn't want to sign a peace treaty. The peace treaty has to be between the U.S. basically and North Korea, supported by South Korea and Japan and China. We wanted to get involved in setting up, in putting together that project, and we still are ready to do it. But the political will of the U.S. has not been there. It's something that needs to be built.
Glenn Ford, do you have a quick view on that one? The peace treaty element, lack of trust?
Well, I mean, firstly, there is no peace treaty that can be signed by the United States because Congress would never ratify it. So I think it's mythical. I mean, which is why the South Koreans are interested in an end of war declaration. That's as close as you can get. And there's a big push on at the moment. It might even happen, but I keep telling the North Koreans, frankly, don't even think about a peace treaty, because what's going to happen is it won't be ratified and the whole thing will fall apart. Okay,
so that's a rabbit hole nobody needs to go down at the moment. Another good, interesting question here. Glenn Ford, let's stay with you with this one, then we'll go to Antonio. For a long time, North South Korea have been divided. The language of these two countries is already quite different. How will the nations overcome the language barrier? Is that right? Do they speak a different language or dialect? Do they understand each other?
Well, I mean, sorry, my Korean is rudimentary, so it's possibly not a very good question for me to deal with. But from my knowledge, but firstly, there is a different lexicon. You know, running dogs of capitalism doesn't actually figure very often in South Korean speech. You've got that, and my son was at the Kim Il-sung University, and I mean, people in South Korea think he's quite quaint because he's got a North Korean accent. That's not true of the economic refugees and defectors in South Korea. They often are discriminated against. So I mean, there are potential problems there. They can understand each other, but it does label you on the tongue in a way that North Koreans do not find very in their favor when they're living in the South.
Well, they have
a different
you're in Latin America, where the same languages is spoken between different countries. Is it a language issue, a dialect issue, or what is it?
No, it's a logic issue. It's a logic issue. It's a moral issue. It's an ethical issue, which we don't have in Latin America. Europe doesn't have it, but North Korea has it in relationship to South Korea. They have a totally different logic. Juche is a very cosmic kind of ideology. It's Kim Il-sungism is shamanism, is the absolutism of the old kings of Korea. It's a mixture of Engels and Lenin, and it's a mixture. But in the center is Kim Il-suism. Kim Il-suism is the thought of Kim Il-sung. And this, people have been educated from cradle to grave with that ideology. So it creates a different logic. And
so just to clarify,
it creates difficulties for the North Koreans to deal with the outside world. But it's not an impossible thing. It's something that they have to evolve if we help them.
Just to clarify for our questioner here, it's not the word translation that is the problem. It's more the mindset and the way sentences are formed and how they're interpreted. An interesting couple of questions here that I think Sebastian Badosa talks about, very relevant when discussing Korean unification, since the former USSR and present Russian geopolitical interests in the area have remained the same along the last 70 decades or more. Antonio, since you're on the screen, can you give us just a few seconds on Russia's role in this? Is it a big player, or is it China, Japan, and South Korea? Is Russia a big player? And how is that changed, or has it changed?
They play a big role before in the past, but after 1990, with the changes of the previous Soviet Union, the role has been diminished considerably, and North Korea is not a major issue for the Russians. They have other fish to fry, you know. I don't think so. If they do, it's just to sour the relationship with the U.S. That's something that they will do consistently, because it's in their interest, you know, to do that. And same thing with the Chinese. But China does have a great interest in North Korea because of the border, and historically, they have a relationship that goes back between Kim Il-sung and Mao.
Yeah, I remember that picture that came a couple of months ago of the Russian diplomats going on the railway across the border as the only way to get out. Glenn Ford, Russia's influence?
I mean, a couple of comments. I agree with Antonio. Russia had a lot of influence until 1989, 1990. It has very little influence at the moment. I've been up on that border. There is nothing happening. There are enormous freight yards that used to bring in hundreds of millions, if not billions, in trade back 40 years ago. That's no longer the case. That's no longer the case anymore. It's rusting. The big influence is China. China is the elephant in the room. If you can't solve the peninsula issues without the United States, you also can't solve them without China. I would disagree with Antonio slightly on Juche. I think it's not Leninism, but anti-Leninism. I think it's a variation of Lukácsian Marxism, but we can go into that.
Right,
Lukács was actually persecuted for taking his kind of, you could overcome practical reality with willpower if you want, but maybe that's for a different day.
Yes, let's not go down an ideological.
No, I agree. I agree with
very quickly.
I agree with that.
Okay, I'm going to keep you on the screen now because you've usurped Glenn, but we'll go back to him. This question here from Askel Ashraf. What was the cause of the failure of President Trump's peace initiative with North Korea? It was promising and could have been good for all concerned. In a nutshell, Antonio.
He accuses Bolton because Bolton is a warmonger. He was the principal advisor to Trump, and he got the wrong guy because he's not for peace or for appeasement. Bolton is for war. So
it was John the guy with the mustache, right?
He was
John
the
Bolton
spoiler.
was the spoiler.
Trump accuses Bolton of being the spoiler.
Okay. About 2 months before the Hanoi summit, Steve Biegun, who was the special Deputy Secretary of State, Special Rep on North Korea, in a speech in Stanford, laid out the choreography of what the North Koreans had to do. They read the speech, learned the dance steps when they arrived. John Bolton was there to say, we're playing an entirely different tune. We want you to give up everything today. And Trump was, if you want, seduced into it, thinking he could get in a wonderful deal. I'm a member of the British Labour Party. I'm proud of the fact I agreed with nothing Donald Trump did apart from North Korea. And even there's the odd little thing. What worries me a little is I'm going to agree with everything that Joe Biden does apart from North Korea.
So because you wrote that thing about the G7, didn't you, slamming them about North Korea. But just to recap for our audience, there was the successful summit in Singapore, wasn't there, where we thought that everything could move forward, and then there was the collapse summit in Hanoi. That was the one that John Bolton, I think that Antonio is saying. John Bolton is. We had
3.5-day trip back to Hanoi. That's to Pyongyang. All of the pro-engagement faction got sidelined, to put it mildly.
We have a sort of very.
Trump loves pomp and circumstance. So the whole trip to the whole engagement with Kim Jong-un was just for that, for pictures, for shown, for a show, for pomp, for all these ceremonials, for himself. Has nothing to do with solving the problem or bringing a new idea, something interesting that will change the equation there. Nothing. It's just he just loves this thing.
Is that right? Did Trump have any idea, or did he have a real thought that North Korea would suddenly become a good American ally in democracy? Glenn Ford?
What do you think?
Well, actually, the North Koreans were interested in pivoting from Beijing to Washington very strongly, partly because they wanted to reset the seesaw relationship they used to have between Beijing and Moscow, and wanted a new one between Beijing and Washington. And clearly, you had to pivot towards Washington at the beginning of that process. I'm not sure whether the U.S. actually rejected that deal or didn't even see that it was there. But I knew it was over when Kim Jong-un did the first summit with Xi, because that showed that he decided that if you want the Washington defense was not on.
That's right.
Stay on the screen, Glenn Ford, because we have Nida Gerbus asking quite an interesting question that I think is unanswerable, but we're going to go for it. I would like to know whether both peoples want to be one people, one country, and what about the two states? That is the question. I didn't
hear the last word, but increasingly, certainly in South Korea, the younger generation are losing interest in reunification, and some of them are being petrified by it. I was at an event a couple of years ago when the South Koreans were pushing, a South Korean group was pushing unification hard. And I said, what about the economic costs? And they said, well, it's only going to mean that people are 20% worse off in South Korea than they are now. And I made the point that there have been mass riots and general strikes in Greece over a fall of 18% in the standard of living. So I think it's a nice idea, but I think it's going to have to be done the North Korean way, by letting the North Korean economy get to a stage where it can neatly slot in rather than assimilation. Assimilation might happen if North Korea collapses. I think the Chinese will want to avoid that. But if that's the case, there are 10 million refugees within 7 days' walk of Seoul.
Yeah,
I agree.
Antonio, if you could answer Nida Gerbus, do the two peoples want to be one people, one country, and what about the states?
That dream was in the elderly, the older people. The young people, I agree with our friend, the previous speaker. The young people are not interested in suffering and diminishing their standard of living that will come because they learned from the difficulties of Germany when they unified and they had to take responsibilities for this nation, even though West Germany was given an average of $5 billion every year because they didn't want that regime to be too bad when they unified. For about 10 years prior to unification, South Korea has been very stingy with the North. Whatever they give is with great difficulties. You know, they don't have a plan, and when they create a pseudo plan, it's immediately killed by the politicians in South Korea who has used traditionally the struggles and the grievances of North and South Korea for domestic purposes. They have no interest in solving the problem.
Okay, so that's the now we've got a stream of questions. We're not going to be able to answer them all. I'm going to put them out there so that our panelists, myself, everybody can think about them, because these debates are going on. And then I'm going to ask both of you to wrap up your thoughts. Mr. Betancourt, did Russia somehow help you in establishing relations with South Korea? What cultural, spiritual exchanges are happening with prayers? That's Alan Rayner. Walter Morath, why could the US override a decision of the UN when the UN is the main part of the peace treaty? Dr. Sheikh Ramsey asks, how much can the US lose if unification happens as South Korea Americanizes beyond change? And one here, is it possible to foster unification process of both Koreas without active share of the USA, China, Russia? There are more, but we have to stop here because we need to wrap up this, what has been a fascinating session. So since you're on the screen, Antonio, you have 30 seconds to give us your thoughts about the debate and the future of the Korean Peninsula.
For that to happen, we have to hear Reverend Moon's ideals and calling for heart and love. But there is no audience at this stage for that, for heart and love. Maybe in 2022, after the pandemic, people have second thoughts and will think more into what is essential for their lives. But today, with the profit motive, you know, violence and unstable regions are very profitable for money makers. So all these things has to be considered. If it's in the interest of the U.S. Economy to have a unified Korea, they will promote it. They will work for it. But no, they profit. The profits are intentions.
If it's in their
potential
interest,
of violence.
For it. Yeah. Glenn Ford, could you give us your final thoughts in 30 seconds, please?
I mean, well, very practically, the world is one in which realpolitik rules rather than if you want treaties, which is why the UN depends on the US rather than the other way around. You're not going to get a solution without two things. Both China and the US are petrified. If there is a unified Korea, it will side with the other. You need to get some deal that where both China is happy and the US is happy, which is not going to be easy. And also to get any solution because of the time scale, both in Washington and in Seoul, it has to be a bipartisan approach because it's three presidents in potentially in both countries. So that means that both Republicans and Democrats, the Democratic Party and the opposition need to be working at this together rather than separately.
That's great. There's a lot of mountains to climb, but no reason not to try to climb them. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Jacques Marion. Thank you, Dr. Katsumi Otsuka, Professor Glenn Ford, Dr. Antonio Betancourt, and me, your host, Humphrey Hawksley. On behalf of the Universal Peace Federation, thank you for being in us. Tune in to this ongoing discussion over the next few days on these really important issues. But for now, from me, goodbye and stay safe.
But I still believe in miracles.
Okay. Brilliant.